I've been researching the ancient Sahara since the mid 70s, and it seemed important once I began discovering first the rock art in the Tassili-n-Ajjer of southeastern Algeria. We're going to be seeing a lot from there, is incredibly ancient. We're talking about the early horizon as much as 12,000 years ago. A lot of the petroglyphs of animals fall into that category, but also the rock paintings of humans are really old. As I'm about to show you, the Saharan civilizations are really ancient. And this is really one of the great traditions of world art. This is just incredibly rich, and yet it's so little known. And it's one of the great artistic traditions of the planet, these rock galleries of the Sahara. So we're going to be looking at Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, a little bit of Mali, a little bit of Western Sahara, and of Morocco. And that's a huge swath of territory, which is why I don't know, I may have to cut this down into separate shows, but at least this time you'll get to see the overview. So I'm going to begin here with the era that is known as the Bubulus phase, based on the fact that there are these bulls, cattle, water buffalo in some cases. This is one of the very oldest styles in the Sahara. And as I said, it's going back before 10,000 BCE. And the older stuff, and this is not always true, but the very oldest stuff is petroglyphs rather than paintings engraved in the rock. And one of the things we see with this art is that it is showing animals that many of which don't exist any longer in the Sahara, because this gigantic desert that we know now was green as recently as 4000 BCE. People were not only herding cattle at that time period, but even earlier on, they had rhinos and elephants and hippos and giraffes. Here's another example of the wild cattle at this stage that are a major focus in this art. And you can see that there's ceremonial relationship going on. We're going to see this over and over again of people engraving deeper and deeper into the rock. So we have the giraffe head, all kinds of animals. And this is because there were actually rivers running through the Sahara at one point in time. And so we can see also there's other kinds of rock mortars. People are pounding perhaps seed grains in these mortars, but there's also ceremonial cut marks, as archaeologists like to call them, into the rock. So there's a lot of interaction with the rock, including even rock gongs, which are known also in Eastern Africa. So the man here is pounding on the rock and it's letting out a ringing sound or some kind of tone. But also this rock, and this is true of the ones also in Eastern Africa, they have been grooving out dust from the rock. So these are ceremonial markings, and you'll see these all over the world in really, really ancient times. This is something humanity did because they're relating to the earth as a living vital force, as a being. And spirals and vulvas, this is another very international pattern. Archaeologists are very often reluctant to recognize these vulva patterns. They're all about the phallic symbolism. But, this is something that the Sahara shares with Ethiopia, with Namibia, and with also Paleolithic Europe and South America and other places. So here's the rivers. We have a boat. And in fact, they have found pottery that is marked with, the women would make wavy lines using the skeletons of fish. So if you can imagine people fishing in the Sahara, riding in boats. And it's also a place, Libya in particular, has some of the oldest ceramics in the world. You can see here they've marked it with fabric or perhaps basketry impressions. And so the only pottery I know of really that's older than this is in Japan. So Africa, Northern Africa, has this exceedingly ancient tradition of making pottery, much of it cord marked, impressed with basketry, or perhaps sometimes cordage or even weavings. Here's some example of the swirly lines. So this style originates in the Sahara at a really great time depth, like we're talking before 8000 BCE. And then some of these people migrate to the Nile Valley. And this style in Sudan becomes known as the Khartoum Neolithic. But the origins of this are in the Sahara. So this upends a lot of the ideas people have about the Nile Valley as the oldest, because really deep in Central Africa, we have cultural influences radiating outwards. And there's been this tendency to cut off Egypt from the rest of Africa, which I've talked about in other shows. But anyway, that a lot of what survives for us, we don't get the basketry or anything like that. We have impressions of it, but a lot of the stone artifacts, and not only the arrowheads, but also grinding stones, ornaments, armbands, different things like that. And a lot of just out there on the desert are grinding stones. And of course, it's much drier now than it would have been. So there would have been grasses. They could be gathering seeds of wild grasses and making them into meal. Here's an example from the Tassili-n-Ajjer, which is one of the main, sort of a mountainous plateau in the southeastern corner of Algeria. And this is where some of the greatest rock art is found. And this too, these rock galleries of the Tassili they show weathering from water. The presence of water is there. But the grindstones are extremely widespread, and we see them. This is the back of a grindstone. So they have these patterns engraved on, this is not the working side of it. And we also see mortars. I gave a couple examples of those earlier for grinding, not just making, these cupels are not for grinding particularly, they're taking rock dust out, but this could have been for pounding grain or even pigments. This is a really interesting picture because these two here are from the Western Sahara. So one far west side of the Sahara, and this one is from Nubia at the other far eastern side. And look at the similarities. Again, these are the backs of the grinding stones. And these would be artifacts associated with women, because pretty much all over the world, when women are gathering, they're collecting seeds and grinding them up. This is a food practice that you see in California, lots of other parts of the world. I'm not really sure what this is supposed to be, except they say it represents an owl, but you can see all sides. I guess this would be the owl face. All sides have symbols, looks like stars and moon crescent on this one. Then we have also icons in stone, and this has been really tough to research. I don't have a site name for this. It looks very authentic to me. I don't think it's a fake, which you do find happening, but she is consistent with the very archaic female figurines, whether they're in ivory, stone, ceramic, of human history in different parts of the world. And here's some other examples. This one, at least we have a site name for. This is on the borders of Mali and Niger, the Azawakh Basin. And here's some other examples from the Mali side. So this one especially is really consistent with what we find in Southwestern Asia, various other regions of the world. In northern Algeria, there's what they call the Capsian culture. And it goes back, this is back to that 10,000 BCE horizon. Some very, very old stoneworking. This is, again, very difficult to find anything on this. You will see writing about the Capsian culture, mostly talking about arrowheads and things like that, but they have this iconography. Here's the symbol we saw earlier of either human or animal heads, especially owl heads and other animals. There's some more owlishy looking ones. So these are beings that are significant in the culture, and this, we're talking such a profound time depth. This is one of the main surviving artifacts from this very ancient layer of culture in northern Algeria. And then quite a bit later on in time, you also have Neolithic stone circles. And there's a site in Algeria called Tabel Ballet. These were part of a stone circle there. I don't think they're very large, but they have this ancestor face that you see on megalithic statues across much of Africa, but also into the Neolithic in Europe. And so there's a megalithic culture in the Sahara that doesn't get discussed very much, all the way from Morocco across Algeria. I'm not even really sure of the parameters of it yet, but this is one ceremonial circle with this huge mound in the center. And then you've got, I think this standing stone is like 9 meters, I think I read somewhere, but you've got like a whole group of them around the circle at Mazora in Morocco. And then other funerary mounds that are surrounded by these protective stone circles. And these are mostly in Algeria, but I wouldn't want to bet that they are limited to there. So here's a good example, because you almost have this symbolism of the womb where you go up this vaginal passageway. There's the uterine center. The original mound is placed there. And then you can see people came along later and added other mounds to this one. There's another example built into the hillside. So these are quite large, these mounds. And also dolmens. I don't have any good photos except for this one, which is in Algeria, of dolmens, but those mounds, some of them would have had megalithic structures like this underneath them. This is at Tiout, and I wanted to show you this overall drawing. It's pretty rough, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, or at least images of hunting magic. And I'm going to zoom in now. This is the clearest one. We have a woman with her arms raised in invocation, ceremonial fringes hanging off of her arms. There's a giant cow there behind her, but they've drawn a line from her vulva to the hunter. And so he is hunting ostrich. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be there. Here's another view of this. So this is a ceremonial, that really basically the role of a priestess who's doing invocation, and at very old time depths before they're actually cattle herding. This is in the desert. These are hunting cultures, the most archaic levels, hunting and gathering. We have these double figures here with gestures of invocation, lots of animals, and you'll have these overlapping humans and animals in the art all over the place. Here's another view so you can see the relationship of the two scenes I just showed you. This bull behind, there's cattle everywhere. Oh, here's another priestess and hunter combination. Okay, now we're in the south, and this is one of the most marvelous of all the rock paintings. It's being eroded at a very fast rate, no thanks to the tourists who are splashing water on it so they can take photos of it. But they call her the Lady of Aouanrhat. And you have this running or dancing woman. She has a crescent, perhaps horns, perhaps a lunar crescent behind her head. She has body markings, which could be tattoos or could be ritual paint, fringes, ritual ties hanging from her arms and legs. She's wearing a string skirt, which is a very strong theme in many ancient cultures. Here's a little more detailed view of her. So the markings on the body, we see these in other places. The breast, the lines along the breasts are something that turn up many, many thousands of years later in the Nok culture around the first millennium BCE. This would be dated somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 4,000 BCE. She's really old, and she is actually painted over older figures. This is really common in the rock art. Here you can see the rainbow. I'm going to give you a better view of that in a moment. And then also there's these numinous fields of energy all around. And this has been taken as a rain cloud, and there's rain pouring, and this is why they're calling her rain goddess, along with the rainbow symbolism here. Here's a painting. It's a little bit clearer to see in some ways. They don't do a very good job of reproducing the lines here, the energetic lines, but it shows the most clearly what is it that she has on her hands. There's a kind of a puppet, a basketry, or perhaps a woven cloth cap that she's got over her hands with streamers hanging down from it. Here is one of the views that's the clearest of the rainbow goddess that is under her legs. So all this rain symbolism is going on. Here's another view of the hands. You can see how eroded this is becoming. But this really corresponds, the clearest analogy I can think of is in Inuit culture. They have these hand puppets that they use in their dances. There could be other reasons for it, like, waving the fringes around could have been part of the dance. And the markings that she has on her body are reproduced from other paintings of this, what they call the Roundhead period. Really, we're talking about afros. They're very naturalistic representations of African people there in the Central Sahara. But you see women with lots of body paint, or perhaps ritual tattoos, or even scarification. Now, some of the recordings of this in the mid-20th century, there was an archaeologist, Henri Lot, who went down there, and his artists that were recording paintings of this art created a number of fakes. So here they're trying to make it look like an ancient Egyptian art, and there are similarities, but not like this. No uraeus crowns in this art. And here's another example. They're really trying to say, oh, look, the ancient Egyptians were here. This is something we often have to deal with along with the illegal trade in stolen antiquities. But these are fake. This is one of their paintings. I don't know. Is this fake or is it real? It looks more similar to the other style. So this could be a real dance, maybe even a rain dance. But we have this problem of verification. And unless there is a photograph of this somewhere, then we would have to classify it along with the phony. So one of the things we see, not only in the Saharan art, but across all of Africa, is a tendency to indicate women by their breasts being in silhouette. It's very common for the lower body to be in silhouette. The rest of it, the shoulders and the head, are frontal. This is something you see in Egyptian art, but it also shows up in Zimbabwe and Namibia and a lot of other places. We're looking here at what they're calling the Roundhead period, and I would really love to come up with another terminology for this, because this is just natural hair, but it's an era where they're not cattle herding yet. They are hunters. They're traveling, foraging people, gathering grains, as we see from the grinding stones. So this is in a time range that is somewhere around 6,000 to 4,000 BCE. So these are old. And some of them are quite beautiful. You can see later animals have been added over this figure of a woman. And sometimes they're shot at. So there's a lot of vandalism going on. A number of the depictions show people living daily life in camps as migratory people, and others are ceremonial scenes. This one is really amazing because the antiquity of it is obvious. First, we have a group of women who may be singing and clapping or just talking very animatedly, but it has the aura of a ceremonial gathering to me. The shininess that you see all over the painting is what they call desert patina, and it's a very strong indicator of antiquity. When the silicates in the sand are blown for thousands of years against the rock, they begin to form like a glassine layer over the paintings, which help to protect them, actually. But we're going to see that on a number of these. This one is a really important scene of ceremonial that I have not been able to yet, even now, after all these decades, get an identification of the site for it. It's unquestionably authentic. This is very much the style of what they call the Bovidian period, that when they are cattle herders, although this scene probably has to do with hunting. So we have a woman as the central figure. I'll give you close-ups on these in a moment, who is blowing on a staff here. A man is kneeling in front of her, presenting his bow. Perhaps this is an arrow. We'll talk about that some more. Behind her, another woman. We've got another figure with a staff. There are people there in the background, and this person is holding their arms out as if to give power to this ceremonial act. So here she is in the close-up. And here, first of all, the breasts coming out on one side. This is totally diagnostic. This is a woman. And you can see her holding, maybe this is her fist, or maybe this is the head of a club, or maybe it's an arrow, because that would relate to the bow that's being held out in front of her. Then also there's this interesting feature because red ochre has been painted over her head. And maybe they're trying to indicate that she is in a state of spiritual potency as the central priestess in this ceremony. Behind her is what I take to be a female elder, possibly white-haired, but the hair is painted with red ochre, long breasts. This is often an indication of elders in this art, really artistically rendered. And we will see here that this is why I was talking about a club. She's got this staff, but it has this bulbous end on it. And this is very analogous with what we're seeing here, although this could represent her hand. And again, the desert patina is on there. So just showing the deep age of this incredible painting. Here's another woman with a staff in her hand, And these are part of a group of paintings that seem to show entranced people who are in spirit journey. They are floating. This is not really how you would stand. This person conceivably could be standing, but this one definitely is not. And you'll see these floating figures also in the far eastern Sahara at Tadrart, which is near the borders of Egypt and Sudan and Nubia, where they call them the swimmers, but it's not at all clear that they could be swimming. But this, I mean, this is the desert by this time. And there are a lot of ceremonial scenes in this art, and women are prominent in them. So you've got a group of dancers here with these very high coiffures. This reclining figure, according to Fulani people who do some similar ceremonies to some of those that are shown here. For example, making the cattle walk between protective fronds of palm leaves as a healing or protective ceremony. The Fulani told a National Geographic writer about this, that this represents the mistress of milk who is chanting to a serpent who, I'm going to give you the next pulled back view, this serpent that is encircling this bull. And so they're saying this is Tianaba, the earth in the form of a snake goddess who is protecting the cattle. So that's a modern saying. And, sometimes the oral traditions can be very long lasting indeed. So that, it's possible that this has this very, very old connection to it. We don't really know, but that's their interpretation of it. We also see animal-headed people or ancestors or shamans or perhaps deities. And this group of women, when you look at this, it's very naturalistic. The figures are flat. It's just flat paint. Kind of reminds me of Chinese art in some ways, where they have these flat areas, but yet they seem to have like this very rounded quality to them. Group of women in skirts walking along, but what about their heads? Why is the rest of the body so naturalistically rendered and the heads are so strange? It's because those are not human heads. Those are snouts. Those are animal heads, maybe even horns or ears. So there's this shape-shifting animal-headed beings, and we do see this in other parts of the Sahara, as well as most famously the ancient Egyptians, whose deities have animal heads. And lots of scenes of dancing, this group of young women dancing. There's some possibility that some of these may represent womanhood initiation ceremonies. Really, this particular style is, what they would call the Bovidian style, is classic for the ancient Sahara. And you could pick this out once you look at it. And if somebody asked you, where's that from? It could only be from the Sahara. It's very, very characteristic style. Here's another ceremony, again, with a cow very prominently shown, and a whole procession of young women who, many of them are holding their hands behind their necks or bowing their heads. You see the same gesture up here. A central figure, I'm going to zoom in on this, apparently covered in white body paint, wearing a string skirt, which is a very common form of ceremonial wear in a lot of parts of the world. Sort of a bending invocation. Look at how finely painted this is. Here's a close-up of the other one up in the corner. Gestures of invocation going on. So this is clearly ceremonial dance that we're looking at. Another example here are two male figures at the far side, and then opposite them, a woman holding mysterious bags. I'm going to zoom in on this. The color is a little bit off on this, but these white bags in her hands. What are they? Are they carrying bags? There is something called the gelta, which is a leather bag that they use to carry water in. Behind her is one of these floating women. So there seems again to be some ceremonial context to this, as is indicated also by the ritual regalia of the male figures over there on the left. So there's a lot of arm raised invocatory or dancing figures. Get a little idea of the size of this from this hand here. And then there's some shelters where there are birthing scenes painted. And this one is actually on the ceiling of the rock. It's an enclosure that is has a number of scenes that have been identified as having to do with birth. So this may have been actually a place women gave birth, went to give birth, or perhaps did prayers and ceremonies for successful healthy births. There's another one. I don't know if this is a birthing scene. That's what they say, but obviously well-advanced pregnancy of this woman with locks, always combined with the animals, perhaps children, smaller sized people there. And this is very interesting because it's part of a larger global pattern of the genealogical tree. We've got women in birthing postures, and it's like the daughter of the mother, the mother, the mother going back. This one has menstrual blood, perhaps, or after birth. There are these vital lines of energy coming out from her womb. So I see this as a matriline. And the Sahara is one of the parts of the world where matrilineal culture remained very active into the 20th century. It's being rapidly displaced by Islam, particularly among the southern Tuareg, but the Amazigan. This is a pattern we see also in the South Pacific, Melanesia, various other regions of the world, these lines of ancestry. Here's a different take, perhaps related to this long red line, which could be indicatory of a lineage, be a lot of other meanings assigned to it, but that kind of birthing posture of the figure, and little traces here of the Tifinagh alphabet, which is a form of writing known all over the Sahara, and something that the Tuareg women have kept alive. It's passed from mother to daughter. This is a rock shelter with, somebody gave it a French name, but apparently a woman in a boat. Here's another female figure painted in there. I think this one is from Libya. And then these are male figures dancing, but I wanted to point this out because thousands and thousands of years later, like maybe as much as 5,000 years later, even more, you will see dancers in Senegal and other places wearing these same kinds of ritual fringes. These are female figures right here. And so there is this long through line from this very archaic art into modern ceremonial culture. And we see similarities also in the classic African mask, the highly abstracted wooden masks already showing up here in Aouanrhat in Algeria. Normally, you will see this figure reproduced and they won't show this other quote unquote roundhead figure, which I think represents a woman. And again, sort of an invocatory gesture. Sefal is another site, really interesting one. There's this long procession of people who do not have human heads. They have round heads, but not just a natural representation of human hair, but heads that actually look like some of the megalithic statues that we see in different parts of Western Africa. This one has a solar disc on her head, maybe even with horns. And this is recalling to us the Hathor and Isis, the solar disc horned crown that you see in Egypt. But anyway, they're advancing toward a central figure, and I don't have a full view shot yet of this, but there is a male figure at the center of this, very, very large. You can see this invoking gestures all the way along. And here's a close-up of the arms raised as they're approaching this central figure. On the other side of him is a woman, again with one of these round marked heads in a posture of birthing, and she's placed directly over an older figure of a sheep. This is what a lot of the petroglyphs look like. This is actually a painting. You can see little traces of the paint here. This is natural light. You can see that they've engraved a groove, like a petroglyph groove around her, almost as if she has wings, and yet you can see the arms below. I've been able to find some photographs of these that bring out the paint using special techniques of lighting, so you can see much more clearly the megalithic patterns that are engraved on this round non-human head, as well as painting on her body and a better view of her overall outline. Same thing here, and I don't have a site name for this one, but in addition to the heads with the patterns, as if they were stone heads, we also see fan-shaped headdresses. And this is something that is very common in Saharan art, and we can go all the way east to the Dakhla oasis, which is in the western desert of Egypt, to see examples also of these fan-shaped headdresses, which may be feathers, they may be some kind of wicker woven crowns that were made. But these figures show another interesting through line because they have waist beads. This is a pattern that's still alive in 21st century Africa and some places, particularly in Nigeria, maybe parts of the Congo. Women who are very large hipped, big lower legs. Here's another drawing to give you a little bit more idea of it. This is the location of Dakhla. So it's between the Nile and the Libyan border, just about halfway through. And Egyptians do eventually make it over there to this oasis. But in this time period, this is really, really old. I don't really have an exact date, but it could be 8,000. I've seen different estimates. Still trying to work that out. Here's another boulder where you've got a woman in the feathered headdress. And you can see her arms there. She's seated. Again, the very large, wide lower body. Another seated figure with her skirt. They kind of have pillar heads. And then there's a third figure of a woman who is standing, apparently, belly thrust forward, and then the hips wide behind. Really hard to make out what's going on over here, but it looks like an animal to me. Here's an example, better color photo, where again you have these thin torsoed but wide hipped skirted women. Kind of hard to make out there. And here they are again. So this time, instead of waist beads, I mean, they could be waist beads or they could be wrapped cloth of some kind. There's our feather headdress on this one. There's two other figures here who are facing or overlapping each other. And then when I saw this part, I was thinking, well, what do they have, shields? Apparently, the archaeological consensus is that these are sandal petroglyphs that were superimposed at a much, much later period. And we do have other examples of these sandal footprints, but they've placed them as if they were shields, as if they're incorporating them into the petroglyphs, something you see very commonly. These are more typical, the side views, where you have the very stick-like upper body and then the large buttocks and the skirts. Here's another one. And this one clearly marked as a woman. Now, what about this protrusion here? And somebody on Facebook was saying, well, these are, how could that be a woman? Well, this obviously is a woman. The protrusion, it's not really clear what that's meant to be. Oh, see, this is the one where they were saying, well, I don't think those are female. It's very uncommon to see males represented with especially the proportionately narrow shoulders and the wide hips. You just don't see that. You can see men with big buttocks, but not like that. And actually, if you look at these, the entire lower part of the body takes the form of a vulva, which we're going to see that vulva art is also represented. But as to this protrusion, here are more examples of it. And this one almost looks like a pregnant belly. So, or else the protrusion occurs very far down. And these are interesting because they almost look like centaurs. They have abstracted out this theme of the big butted woman almost into an animal shape, as if this is a half human, half animal form. In the background here, we have giraffes. And superimposed over this, here we see the Egyptians coming in, because this is the Scythian animal, who you'll sometimes see called Typhon. So the battle of Horus and Seth, that's the divinity they're talking about there, who is associated, by the way, with the desert. There are layers in this art. And we can see that here very clearly, because next to this extremely deeply grooved vulva is a swastika. And we're talking about many, many millennia before anybody heard of the Nazis. But the swastika is later, by common consensus. The vulvas are original, and they have quite a few variations on vulva patterns in Dakhla. Some of them with these vaginal openings grooved into them, others quite triangular. Here again, we have people who are grinding out rock dust from a portion of the rock that is symbolically sacred, possibly for conception magic. I've seen instances where it also related to bringing rainfall or other kinds of increase. And I'm not going to go into Karkultal in depth here because this show would be way too long. But this is that borderline corner of Egypt that I was talking about. Big rock formations, lots of rock art. And we have, again, here's the rhinoceros from the old animal style. But we also have figures of women, one of them at least wearing feathers, perhaps, in her headdress. And this one is just amazing. From Karkultach, we have a Black woman heavily adorned in what appears to be gold jewelry. And her hand is, for all appearances, holding a spear and getting ready to hurl it. So possibly a huntress, possibly a warrior. This is going to be very old. I don't have a good dating on that. Okay, back again to Algeria. I just did that little excursion. But here again, the figure of a very vigorously dancing woman. Look how deeply bent the waist is. Her breasts, again, the lines of dotted patterns. This may have been something that women tattooed on themselves on their attainment of menarche as part of womanhood initiation ceremony, because it's quite pervasive in the art. But swinging her arms, ceremonial dance. And this is when I want to look at the ecstatic dimension, the shamanic dimension of some of this art. We have a flying figure with unnaturally elongated arms who seems to be towing this crouching figure with its arms wrapped up against the chest along as she flies. And I say she because you can see there the breasts. So we have our diagnostic female, and also the belt with the ornament, which is being worn on both of these figures. This one may have originally also been painted white and just got eroded out. So these are not white people. These are paintings of the ancestral realm. These could be a female shaman performing a soul retrieval. That's one possible way of looking at this. A spirit flight for sure seems to be indicated in this. And there's this other interesting figure here that looks a little bit like a snail. Not really sure what's going on there. Here is a different photo treatment of this. The colors aren't natural, but just used to enhance a little bit more what else can be visible in this. You can make her head out a little bit there. And another thing we see in the Tassili art is a lot of observers see these as mushrooms. And there are suggestions that they were using shrooms and theogenic mushrooms in their ceremonies of all these representations of ecstatic dance that we see here. I don't know why the mushrooms would be emerging from her butt, but this is not the only example of mushrooms that show up in the art. Now, we could argue that these are simply headdresses with dotted patterns on them. This is kind of interesting up here too. You've got a woman in a fringe skirt wielding a staff, apparently. But if we go into Chad, we see these same patterns, kind of unusual for a coiffure, for it to be hanging out quite that far. It does look like Amanita muscaria with the little white dots. And if that wouldn't convince you, they even emphasize this more in these are a line of male figures all the way across here who very much look like mushroom heads. So that's a theory. Make of it what you will. A lot of really interesting rock paintings at a site called Tin Abenhar. And by the way, I just have to mention tin in the Amazigh language, in Tuareg, means mother of. So we have a lot of names or title of mother, perhaps, maternal type names on these site place names. But again, these beautifully rendered figures, I would put these somewhere between 5,000 and 3,000 BCE. And again, ceremonial dance going on. Here's a larger pulled back view. You can see more figures there below. This is classic Saharan painting. It's one of the great world art traditions. Look at this beautifully rendered figure of a woman. Jabaran, another site. This is one where some of the fakes were purported to have been made at Jabaran, but they don't in fact exist there. And then there are a lot of scenes with people who are daily life, people living their lives in camps, sometimes children, hearth, sleeping places. It looks like she's packing up perhaps or preparing food. It's not really exactly clear. Another figure of a woman walking here. And all of this is superimposed over a much older animal figure. But sometime around 4000 BCE, maybe a little bit earlier than that, 5000 BCE, they start herding cattle. So you'll see this referred to in the literature as the Bovidian period. So, basically the cow people. And they aren't anymore just hunting, they are herders and traveling about with these cattle. And sometimes on these cattle. So this is a little hard to make out. It's a little bit of a murky photo, but we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 women at least here who are riding on cattle. And I'm going to refer back. This is one of the paintings from Lot's archaeological crew. And for a long time, I was kind of wondering, is this for real? And I had seen claims that it was not, but now that we have a photograph of it, I think it is authentic. And this is a style that we're going to be looking at next, which is called the Iheren or the Tahilahi style. That is part of the Tassili layering of different styles. These are later than the earlier dark black paintings and sort of more fine lines characteristic of this style. But you see women in leather capes riding on the back of cattle. It's a little difficult to make out, but you can see the fringed cape of this woman, a hunter with a throwing stick in the foreground. This is a little easier to see. And so here they are riding on the cattle in their capes. And sometimes the cattle are also shown with things packed on them. There's an ostrich up here. They have child carriers or bundles that have all of the bedding or whatever else clothing that they use in their daily life because they're not staying in one place. They need to come to new grazing areas periodically. And so they're moving around. They're migrant people, nomadic people. So here she is tying the bundle onto the cow. And here, actually, this one's a bull. You have a sling with a baby riding in it. And there's even a little covered area for perhaps an older child to sit in, riding on the cow. Here's a person with the child in their arms preparing to load them. And this is something that still existed in the Sahel region, which is all drying up very rapidly. So there's this whole loss of lands. It's not really possible to survive anymore with cattle in much of the Sahel as it used to be. But you can see that the Wodaabe people, who are also called the Bororo, traveling with these packs laden onto the backs of the cattle. So they are survivors. They are descendants of these very, very archaic paintings, which are at least 4,000 years old, 4,000, 3,000 years old. This one's interesting, woman with bow. And the long skirts you don't see on any male figures. This is a male right here. They often have body paint, but huntress, warrior, who knows? This is really, really hard to make out. Here is a drawing showing the style of the women. So these people look different than some of the older layers, possibly ancestors of the Amazigh or the Berbers, as the Greeks call them. But there's really a lot of different ethnic strands going on in here. And here another, these are rock shelters. Iheren, mother with child. Pretty hard to make out. You can see her legs and skirt. Much of the rest of her has been effaced. A lot of these are very heavily weathered. But then these huntresses. And here's the hunting stick, the throwing stick again. Group of 3 running women. These are just like masterpieces of art, of world art. I'm going to give you close-ups of the heads, where you can see that especially this one is wearing, on this one, it looks like it could be cornrows, not braided, knotted hair. But here it's riding above the head. And so whether this is twined basketry, that would be my guess, that they had woven something out of vegetable fibers. So really like a hat. This figure may be wearing the same thing, but look at the artistic magnificence of these paintings. These are very clearly African women, and they don't really seem to appear in any of the anthologies of world art. There is a silencing of the existence of these treasures that I was able to find these online, but it wasn't easy. Here's one more of this hat or headdress almost looks like a human fingerprint, very definitely set off from her silhouette of her face. Then there's a later style where the heads become like pillars, very, very abstract style. There are some similarities to the older art. I'm not sure if she's holding a rattle, like a gourd rattle, or could that possibly be a mirror in her hand? You can see very abstract seated women, so their knees are sticking out here, possibly playing a musical instrument here. Another seated female figure. This could be part of a camp scene. And sometimes the red ochre is really bright, quite amazing. And the silhouettes of these figures, well, these actually do have heads, but this particular shape keeps recurring in the Saharan art. So I'm going to take these long skirted figures as female and then the male figures with spears in this painting. Here's a close-up of that. Same style. And this is very congruent in certain ways, again, with Egyptian art and with Southern African art, where you've got the frontal view of shoulders and then the silhouette view from the side of the lower body. And these are later than what I was showing before. I'm trying to keep this chronologically. It looks like they're also wearing skirts on this that are supposed to be maybe transparent. I'm not really sure what those loops are supposed to be. The chariot comes in this time frame. So this is what they call the horse period. And it happens after, where's my notes? I've lost them. Sometime after 2000 BCE, as I recall. And so you have the charioteer down here, the female figures up there above. Here's a close-up on them. These kind of thin heads. You can see the breast sticking out on the side of some of them. A larger seated woman. And here's a real good example of a campsite scene. So they're there with their cattle. People are sitting around together. And we can see the outlines. And this is still true in the Tuareg have tents, but the Wodaabe and some of the other indigenous people in the Sahara who survive there just make a brush shelter to keep the cattle from straying into their sleeping area. And so it's just like basically a border. The house is roofless, right? And, people lying down and resting in there. There's more examples of these camp scenes. This one, a little bit on the patriarchal side, he's grabbing her, not by her hand, but by her arm. And this is a gesture you see sometimes in other patriarchal art traditions. But anyway, Libya. So Libya is one of the countries that's most off the radar. And I actually created a whole show on Libya that I did last year. Eventually, we're going to have a stream on demand of it. But this is an aerial view of the Mesak Setafit, or the Tadrart Akakus, the Akakus Mountains. This is from way up in space, as you can see. These are all again, the erosion by water that I was talking about in the Algerian side of the border. That's the Tassili. On the Libyan side, it's the Tadrart Akakus. So just a different rock formation, the same kinds of slightly different styles, but again, very strong tradition of petroglyphs. This cattle herding people, they've got their household goods hanging up on poles here. So this is another one of these camp scenes with their animals. One of the most precious petroglyphs in the whole Saharan tradition is this one from Wadi Taleshout. She doesn't have a face, she has horns, and she has these vulture heads pointing out in two directions. Clearly female, the breasts with perhaps milk streaming down from them, very deeply grooved in the rock. Her hands, this is very much like the Sheela-na-gig sacred display tradition, where she's got her hands to the vulva. And again, you have this ceremonial scraping out of rock dust. People are trying to connect with the energy behind this figure, whether she is an ancestor, a shaman, a goddess. We don't really have anything to go on in terms of interpreting this, except that she if she's supposed to be human, she's in a shape-shifted condition where she takes on animal attributes. It's more likely that she is a deity or an ancestor because of this way that people are trying to connect with her. So Libya is full also of red ochre paintings. This is a good view of the overall rock shelter where these figures, there's a lot of classic running figures, and I haven't included most of these in the slideshow because I'm really concentrating on the women here, but there are a lot of running male hunters in a style that bleeds all the way up into Spain in the Mesolithic period. Zooming in, and so there's the hunter. This may be hunting magic, the women who seem to be making music, waving stabs, perhaps blowing on a trumpet here. Another view even closer. So it looks like she's playing a musical instrument to me, and perhaps beating sticks against each other, or maybe there's some other ceremonial reflection of something that's being done with stabs. Same kind of silhouette though that I've been outlining in this. And then this rock shelter is really interesting. This is still the Tadrart Akakus mountains, where we have a scene. I want you to see first the overall view of it, that we have a line of women dancing with, as you were going to see, with gourd rattles. There's an ostrich here. There's a whole lot of cattle in this scene. And then there's this other ceremonial image that we're going to zoom in on a little bit here. So we can see the cattle were here first because this woman was painted over them. So this is a little bit later, and the style does appear to be later. They each have a rattle in their hand. So we're seeing a ceremonial dance. This figure has beads around her ankle. And then here we have what appears to be a curing ceremony. That's how I interpret this. I'm going to zoom in on that to give you a little bit of a better view of it. Let's go back one. This figure here has an extremely swollen belly. Now, this could conceivably be a pregnancy, and this has to do with, part of a birth ceremony, but I'm more inclined to think that this has to do with swelling from disease. There's all these little things going on, swirling around inside her belly. This is much bigger than a pregnancy would actually appear. And we have this figure with perhaps another with the gourd rattles in the hand. I'm saying this is a female because of the way the cloth is drawn up around the breasts. You never see male figures in long skirts, much less wrapped around the breasts, as you still do in some parts of Africa today. The face here, though, is not a human face. It's painted in white. It's probably a mask, animal-shaped muzzle to this mask. And she's also, out of her very long hair, wearing plumes. So ceremonial regalia I see going on here. So going backwards again. Oh, one last piece. Coming out from the bottom of her is very similar to the feathers in the tail of the ostrich. I don't know if that means she's supposed to be wearing, that this could be somehow an ostrich face or some other kind of animal face, but very intriguing scene here. Another ceremonial scene here, and this time we have a mother, I would take it to be. You see the breasts protruding there. And she's handing a staff to a girl who has little breasts here. So I'm sexing this as female. She's as if she's transmitting power to her daughter in an initiation ceremony. The male figures are supporting her, and they're also in ceremonial gear. So I take this as a womanhood initiation ceremony. I've never seen any commentary by anybody else about that. There's another really huge bull, and again, invocatory postures of this figure below, the arms raised up. There's another woman here behind, a woman seated here, and then again, one of these floating figures who seems to be swimming through the air. So this too seems to have ritual implications to it. And that's also visible here at Tin Annenouin. And we're still in Libya, especially this central figure of a long-skirted woman with the gesture of invocation. We see that on a couple of the other figures through here, but we also see camp scenes where people are just carrying on with daily life. Over here in the palm forest, so we're in an oasis somewhere, another invoking figure. I'm going to pull us back out a little bit so you can, this is black and white, but you can see a little bit more of things going on. This is kind of an interesting figure up here. And then close up in the upper right of that same painting, here's our people in camp. And here your charioteer driving a 4-horse chariot. And we have what I would take to be female figures playing drums. That's what it looks like. They have sticks in their hands and they're holding something out. So maybe it's some other percussion instrument, but it looks like it could be a hand drum in front of a seated woman. And then this is the really pulled back view of the whole scene. So here's what we viewed initially with the palm forest. Here are the drummers, and there's lots of other things. So this is so tightly painted over in layers, it can be very hard to see what all is going on. We do see examples of the Tifinagh alphabet, which is related to the Amazighen, or the so-called Berbers, Tuaregs. And I would take this scene to be ancestral to their cultural tradition. Close up of one of the camp scenes going on here. This also could conceivably be a birthing scene where she's being supported at the sides by 2 other figures. Either that or she's getting helped up. The hair shampooing motif comes up in a number of these paintings. We see it again here. This is a different picture. And so you'll have what appears to be a woman being aided by a man in hair washing or perhaps hair dressing. The men often have this top knot that kind of falls forward over their foreheads, as you see here. And then this mysterious robed figure, which could be an elder, perhaps a woman elder. We can't really, it's not a sexed figure, but flanked by 2 male figures, perhaps a priestess, ceremonial leader. Lots of dancing scenes. This one's a petroglyph etched into the rock. And we've got these joyously dancing women kicking their heels up. So Tin Lalan has a lot of scenes of Shilonagig or sacred display figures, birthing figures, if you will, their legs parted, their arms also held out. And this is an ancestral symbolism in a lot of world traditions. You know, this is the progenitor, the progenitrix, the female progenitor. So there's the ancestral connection, which you can see very clearly here. Again, rock dust being carved out, dug out from the site of potency, the site of progeneration, the site of sexual ecstasy, mask-like face on her. And then there are other scenes that are, here's another progenitrix type image. This is very much a world pattern. Too bad I don't have a photo of this one. And this one, I don't have a site name. I'm still looking for this man's book because this is really classic Sheila type iconography, but there's no site identification. So this is the only picture I could get of this. Here's another one, again, 2 male figures as I see it, flanking a female figure who appears to be bearded. Maybe she's just wearing something, a necklace or something around her face, but very clear marking of the vulva. And in combination, as we are continually seeing with various kinds of animals, this one looks like a lion. Lots going on in this, including some Tifinagh characters, animals, perhaps animal-headed human figures. Is this supposed to be a heart or a mask, or we don't really know exactly what, but multi-layered, and some of these, again, very deeply grooved into the rock, perhaps over long centuries. She has a head that reminds me of nothing so much as the hippopotamus goddess Tadrart out of the Egyptian tradition. Hippo face, apparently, but with the teeth of a lion. And this is part of Tadrart's iconography. I don't know if there's any relationship. It could simply just be an animal, like a lion face but it kind of reminds me of those hippos. And then a pair here shown layer upon layer. It's interesting because they have animal footprints on this one, all over the whole painting, actually. Various things going on there. And then there are the erotic paintings. So there are quite a few heterosexual explicit scenes here with bits of Tifinagh alphabet around them at this site that is called Tin Lalan. So this particular place, and I don't know if there's any kind of ceremonial connection of why these were found in this one site. There may be erotic scenes elsewhere. I haven't found any. This is actually what the previous slide looks like in color. A little harder to make out, but interesting because in a lot of them, the male has animal head. And there again, there's this idea perhaps even that these are not men, but spirits who the women are conceiving from these potent figures. The lines across her body showing her own potency. Again, the animal head. The women always shown sideways, the male figures standing. And they've made inscriptions. I would give a lot to see Amazigh person interpret what all has been written here. So there's quite a few of these: sex, conception, ancestry. Then there's others, and we're still in Libya here, that are processions. And these are really interesting because especially this upper tier, we see women carrying loads. And this could have to do with migrations, especially if they're that old, before the cattle period. They're not loading up cattle, they're carrying it themselves. And this would have been an important part of daily life as they're going from oasis to oasis in search of food. There's another view of the same kind of thing. This is Ouan Amil and this beautiful ochre procession all the way across this rock face, along with white figures added in, perhaps at a later period. Here are some of the white figures, and again, the invoking lifted arms. Most of this is not too clear from the same site. So these white paintings seem to be later, and some connection of them stylistically with what we were seeing in the Iheren style that I was showing before. A skirted woman, almost like a flamenco dancer, and the dotted spheres of energy around her. She's been defaced a little bit here, so it's hard to make out what's happening here. A girl, you see them painted white quite a lot. And there's the dog again. Red and white paintings, which are maybe around the first millennium BCE. You can see the white here is not painted, it's actually calcification salts from water flowing down. And a woman with staff. This is pretty clear cut. She's got a bag on her elbow. We're going to see some more of that in a minute when we get to Niger. This is a different style, and again, maybe womanhood initiations, women wearing fringed skirts, looks like very young women to me, and also headdresses of possible feathers. Dancing women. And this is a later Libyan style where they're really into the cattle. You'll see this over much of Africa through Sudan into Tanzania. They're just wild about their cattle. And we have here a very large figure of a woman who's leading a procession of cattle whose horns have been adorned very heavily with fringed regalia. So this could be a blessing of the cattle, or just one of their festivals, one of their annual festivals, male figure here accompanying her, but she's the central leader of the scene. Now here is another one very like that. Wadi Taleshout. Some other views of it. And here's another figure done in that same style with kind of a hooded headdress and a feather coming off of it. Here too, right there where the vulva would be, there's this carved out rock. So they're scraping out rock. Somehow this figure has vital power that people find significant. Perhaps it's an ancestor. Here, a man who is milking one of the cattle. So this is a style all of its own. And now we come to Niger. Amazing landscapes here. These are actually human structures, and I don't know what that is, but I really like that picture. So on the wall of a mountain in the Aïr region is this very deeply grooved female figure with her arms in the gesture of benediction. It doesn't look like a human face. I've talked about this before. It almost looks like there's two animal ears or even horns. And this is really, really old, but you can see that modern people have climbed up in there and colored her in with charcoal and with white clay. So there's a ritual renewing that still goes on among the Amazigan, the so-called Tuareg. That when they travel past this mountain, they leave offerings of cloth or food or other things at the base of this mountain. So these are divinities, maybe ancestors as well, but they are seen as protective and blessing figures. So this is the largest one. You can see her here. And then there's a small one here at the left, some more animals. Another figure here, which I also take as a woman, a smaller one like a child. There's another one up here, which I have not been able to get a photograph of, but there are basically 5 figures, and you can get a better view here of the cliff wall that they're engraved upon. Here's a different angle of view, and the color isn't not so strong in this, but the horns come through a little more clearly there. This figure has a disc, perhaps a solar disc on top of her head. These lines that are next to them, I don't know if people are trying to put, a staff or an arrow, something like that in their hands. You can see dogs in this. Here's another view of the same part of the petroglyph. There's some more young pictures here of camel riders who come in after 1000 BCE. So this part is older. You can see the sort of childlike figure here, but in a long robe. Here's another view of that same part. It's very interesting having these different photographs because either the lighting or the angle of the view makes them appear quite different. Like this one is really foreshortened from what we see here. She's quite a bit longer. And then at the far left, that's the figure I pointed out before. Maybe a bow and arrow in her hands, could be a staff, other things. Interesting to think about, what do these female figures signify? So Niger has other very different styles, and these are boulder fields where you see both petroglyph, and they've also painted this with a little traces of red ochre, so it appears. And I was talking before about the bag hanging from the elbow of that woman in the earlier slide. This particular style, you'll see a lot of these with a circular object. And is it a bag? Is it a drum? It's really not clear. This one is, the people who like alien theories have a field day with this kind of stuff. But they are probably ancestral beings that they don't have human faces. You've got kind of a representation of chakras going down the middle of her body. There's another one with the little circular thing hanging off the arm, a horse. So you can see these are on boulders rather than on clip faces. Really interesting eyes on these. Here's another one with the circle, these 2 outer figures with the circle, whatever it is. And without the circle, here's a clearly male figure with mustache and a bunch of Tifinagh script. These are a little bit more stick figurey, but again, you have this is not clear exactly what she's slinging around there, a circular object. Here it appears to be a mirror. So there's a possibility that this is a mirror. There's the loops that we saw also in that earlier painting. The idea of a mirror as something that might have magical significance. I don't think these are nearly as old as what I've been showing you before, but I don't have really any way of dating these. These could even be after the first millennium BCE. They could be more recent. It's just really hard to tell. Here's good examples of either grinding mortars or also cut marks. Again, grinding rock dust out from these boulders out there on the land. And then there's a place that the local people call Niola Doa, which means beautiful ladies. So here's a good close-up to give you just a taste of how we have these figures. They don't show the breasts, which we've been seeing along, but we have big butts. And they have elaborate coiffures, usually a wand or a switch that they're holding over one shoulder. A lot of them are ornamented around the neck. There's some little fringes coming off here on the side. Here's a view, and I don't have a full view of the entire rock. I had to kind of composite this across the page that I took this from. But you see elder women in long skirts, and then you see these younger women who are basically naked. They have belts on, that's about it, and their ornaments. So they're wearing regalia, but they're nude. And they all have this energetic pattern flowing through their bodies. They're clothed in symbols rather than cloth or leather. They don't have faces, they have energy fields. Down below here, you can see examples of people coming to this rock to sharpen knives. So here's some close-ups. Here again, these ties that I was showing you around the necks and the wrists also happen around the belt. So the ceremonial women's belt, which is a thing. Different kinds of patterns inside the body, some of them looking like animals with legs. Others are just energy fields flowing through them. And when girls reach menarche, they're believed to be in a state of great potency, which is why I think that these have to do with a womanhood ceremony. And the staff has some significance. This one has been pointed out as possibly a multi-legged animal. There on her belly, there's a lot of different signs. This one might even have ducks there. Another view of the rock sharpening stone. This is not the greatest drawing, but it shows you how there are several figures of older women interspersed between the much larger images of the young women. And there's a lot of other sites all around this particular cliff that show what may be also invoking female figures. There's a lot of other petroglyphs surrounding this in the whole region. There are actually several sites just in that one area. Very parallel to this, and I don't have a place name for this, is this scene. Here's a very large figure of a woman, the breasts coming out the side. And again, no breasts on these younger women, but they're fattened, they're very large, and they too are holding, this time they're holding them out rather than against their shoulder, a staff, some kind of a ritual staff. We have a couple of these figures in the position of invocation that we've seen before in other Saharan art. These are kind of similar in a way, skirted figures, red paint with white dots. So again, that numinous energy, they're shown as being filled with power. This in Chad is interesting, but I'm showing you this first to give you the overall picture. But there's a whole line of women dancers along here, combined with cows. There's some male figures interspersed amongst here as well. Here's what it looks like in the actual painting. You can see the white is faded quite a bit, but they're wearing what appear to be white, perhaps woven linen skirts. The dogs always present. And other kinds of dancers, perhaps ancestral beings with these fan-shaped or feather headdresses showing up. These could be extremely old. They're similar to a Kel Esuf style that is considered to be one of the oldest in all of the Saharan art. And this is just a very small petroglyph, but you have an ecstatic dancer. Her head is reared back. She's got her arms raised to the heaven. She is dancing. Her knees are bent. And this is very shamanistic. Vulvas, again, what kind of weird photo, because these are engravings in the rock, and yet in this picture, they look like they're sticking up out of the rock. Concentric circles. These look like human figures to me down below. So Chad is really a much ignored country, as Libya is. I would see this as a vulva petroglyph. There's a lot of other markings on this rock, and we do see vulva signs in the petroglyphs in Chad. These are some examples that I found. concentric circles or perhaps vulvas. There's still a gigantic cow here in the background. Lots of little drillings into the rock. And also portal shapes. This is something that shows up in megalithic art in Europe as well, this shape. Here's some more examples of it in conjunction with the cattle, the beloved cattle. So then the horse period follows. And this is a different style, but you do see people riding horses, the chariots, pillar-headed, and also these interesting mask-like heads, dancing groups of women and men. The drummer over here. So this is very typical outline that's specific to Chad. These skirted figures with the arms kind of bent at the elbow, lines of dancers, cattle, more cattle. And they too have camp scenes. We can see the houses, tents, whatever they are. They look like woven grass or layers of matting, perhaps. Women sitting together, various activities going on, lying down inside one of the enclosures. This is what the paintings I just showed you before represent. This is an actual photograph of them. And we could compare this also with the fanned headdresses that I was showing you before. Some of them appear to be headless. Now, in some cases, the archaeologists say that the heads were simply effaced because they were of a less powerful paint that wasn't unable to withstand the erosion. But these look like they were intentionally headless, and that may have to do with some kind of ancestral or spirit significance. Here's the same kinds of outlines, except they do have these little white pillar heads on them. More women dancers. Here's a really fine example of a monochrome painting. Classic Chadian rock painting style. Seated, cattle lying down, line of dancers. This one also may have a drum in her hand. Enedi is the name of a rock formation, sort of a mountainous area in northern Chad. And so ample opportunity of places to engrave these labyrinths and these energetic patterns. This is one of the most beautiful paintings in Chad, in my opinion. Group of people, but you've got this male-female couple, and her hair is combed out to a very wide afro. Same kind of basic silhouette that we've been seeing. And this one just blows me away. Multiple necklaces, waist beads, leather skirt, this style of representing the hair, almost like a half moon. Really beautiful. A little taste here from Mali. I don't have much from there. And this looks too like a little bit like the pillar head theme that we were seeing, where you've got this very thin face and then mostly just the hair, kind of an asymmetrical hairstyle on both of these. Group of women who are dancing together. They're bent at the waist very vigorously. Finally, Morocco. And there again, lots of patterns that people took the trouble to engrave on these rock outcroppings. It took a lot to climb up there. I don't think it would be easy. These beautiful patterns of spirals. You have the portal patterns, quadrants, lots of different styles. Just these rocks out there on the land. And one of the motifs I interpret as a vulva motif inside this very abstract human figure. It's the central feature. Sometimes the vulva, if that's what it is shown on its own. Here you've got the animals in combination with it. Part of the idea might have been the proliferation of animals, that prayers that more animals would be born. Here the animal itself is curved around one of these vulva signs. And more mortars combined with ostriches. Here's another figure that looks like these semi-human figures I was just pointing out. These two could be vulva signs. They could be interpreted as leaves or other kinds of growth. But I've seen in New Mexico these same kinds of patterns of lines of vulvas. Could go back to the idea of multiple lineages, spirals, and what look very much like human figures with their arms raised above their head. They see this scattered around in different places, but especially in Morocco. And I'm not, Kel Essouf is that style I was talking about. This is one of the most archaic styles. So kind of difficult to make out. For this, I wondered if these were supposed to be breasts and these were supposed to be arms. But if I look at this one, these are not the same petroglyph, but they're very similar. It looks like four-legged beings. And then these giant heads with these patterns, vibrational patterns inside of them. Finally, this last one example from the Western Sahara. She's got braids sticking out on either side. Her arms are raised. So one more of these dancing, invoking figures. The last part here, I want to touch a little bit on women warriors. We have, having dismounted from her camel, this woman having a knife fight with a man who has gotten off of his camel. And this is from Bardergolo in Chad. This is where we saw some of those white skirted dancers, either earlier on, kind of the pillar head once again. Here's a woman charioteer. That's how I interpret this. Most of the charioteers are male in Libyan art, but there is this example. And here a woman riding with a man on a chariot. And here I want to come back to this style that we've been observing, which is so classic for much, especially the later Saharan art, is the silhouette view of the lower body, the big butt, the long skirt, the upper body facing frontally. So we see that with all these figures. And we see it here. These are examples, again, from Libya. And now I want to compare this. One last shot here. This one's Algerian. I want to compare this silhouette with possible Libyan influence on ancient Greece. This is pottery from Attica, painted pottery from the late geometric period, so like around 750 BCE. And it shows the same outline, which I haven't found in any art anywhere else except the Sahara, and particularly in Libya. And the Greeks have traditions of the Danaides, the 50 daughters of Danaus, the king of Libya, who flee for refuge to Argos from being forced to marry the 50 sons of the king of Egypt. So this is a Greek myth, but there seems to be some kind of historical connection of archaic Greece to Northern Africa. When we look at not only the silhouette style that I was pointing out, but also the profiles of the heads or even the closely cropped hair that we see in this painting, it screams Africa to me, and a variety of other paintings in this same late geometric style, the same thing. They even have locks which don't flow down the back of the head, but actually stick out away from the head, the way that African locks do. And I'm comparing here the silhouette of this woman's face to carvings in West Africa. This basic profile, the African profile, also shows up in rock art all the way down in Southern Africa. So there's this very strong African motif. And this is something I'm going to explore in my book, Women in Greek Mythography, Pythias, Melissae, and Titanides. A section in chapter 2 looks at the Libyan connection, evidence in geometric ceramics for African influences on Greece, especially in depictions of women mourners on funerary vessels. For more on this, see my earlier video, Women in Greek Mythography, or better yet, the book itself. You can look for the Suppress Histories portal on Teachable, recordings of earlier webcasts that I've done in the same way as the one that you're just completing here.